So the way I teach it now to the students in the civilian world here is that fly the airplane, aim somewhere, fuel, ignition, air. Now commit to the glide, and committing to the glide is put your hand on the propeller control and pull it to the low RPM position.
That's Tom Turner talking about what to do after an in-flight engine failure. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott, the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today we'll be talking with Tom Turner about how to troubleshoot a partial or total engine failure in flight. Now, every engine is, of course, going to be a little different, but there are some generic steps for troubleshooting an engine failure. And so that you don't miss next week's episode in whatever app you're listening to now, take a moment right now, go out and find that subscribe or the follow key and touch it so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. Last week in episode 267, we talked about the fatal breakup of a Medevac Pilatus PC-12 in Nevada. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/267. And this is a listener-supported show supported by, yes, you. So if you're learning anything from these episodes and you get some value from it, please just take the 2 or 3 minutes it takes right now to go out and become a member, sign up, join the club, and support Aviation News Talk. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And of course, we've included a link for that in our show notes. This week in the news, there was a mid-air collision in Florida, and separately, the preliminary report is out on a mid-air collision that occurred in Australia. A passenger dies in flight from severe turbulence, and we have 2 unusual helicopter stories from the Southwest. All this and more, and the news starts now. From flyingmag.com, NTSB releases details of Florida mid-air collision. The mid-air collision between a Piper Cherokee and a J3 Cub on floats that killed 4 people in Winter Haven, Florida, Tuesday may have occurred when both aircraft were attempting to land, according to an NTSB preliminary report. According to the report, the pilot of the Cherokee, which was operated by Sunrise Aviation on behalf of Polk State College, was attempting to land on runway 29 at Winter Haven's regional airport. The pilot of the J3 Cub was attempting to land at Jack Brown's seaplane base. NTSB lead investigator Lynn Spencer said, quote, "The J3 Cub was in one of the normal corridors for approach to land on the lake, and the Cherokee was performing a short approach to runway 29, which involves a tighter turn and closer to the runway and steeper descent angle." Spencer added that the student pilot aboard the Cherokee was training for a commercial pilot certificate. The Cherokee was in a left descending turn and came nose to nose with a Cub, which attempted an evasive maneuver, said Spencer, adding that the NTSB were looking at the equipment of each airplane. According to Spencer, the pilot of the Cherokee was self-announcing location and intention, and the Cub pilot was not. This might indicate the Cherokee was unaware of the Cub, or the Cub could not hear the Cherokee, she said. Spencer noted that the airspace, Class Echo, where the collision occurred, does not require the use of radios or pilot communication. The J3 Cub does not have an electrical system and does not have a built-in radio. Pilots who fly Cubs in airspace that requires a radio or who desire a radio usually carry a battery-operated handheld device. After the aircraft are removed from the lake, they will be transported to a secure facility in Jacksonville, where the wreckage will be studied. In particular, investigators want to determine the impact angle, as the Cherokee is a low-wing design and the Cub a high-wing. If the Cherokee is above the Cub, the wings of both aircraft create a blind spot which can limit a pilot's ability to see and avoid the other traffic. And our second story comes from Australia and has a similar theme. From ctpost.com, Australia helicopter pilot didn't hear any call before crash. A helicopter pilot told investigators he didn't hear a pilot on the ground announce he was taking off before the fatal collision of their aircraft at an Australian theme park, according to the preliminary report released Tuesday. The investigators said they haven't ruled out the routine radio call being made by the other pilot, however, and plan to investigate further. The 2 SeaWorld helicopters collided during scenic flights January 2nd at the tourist city of Gold Coast near Brisbane. The incoming pilot, Michael James, managed to land his damaged craft after the collision and save those on board, but the other helicopter broke apart in midair and crashed into shallow water. The departing pilot and 3 of his passengers were killed, and 9 people were injured. The ATSB report found that as James returned from his 5-minute flight, He saw 6 passengers being loaded onto the second Eurocopter helicopter, but his assessment was that he would be clear of the craft and it would pass behind him. James told investigators that as he came into land, he didn't see the other helicopter departing and was focused on the landing site and on managing the downwash of his rotors to avoid a pleasure boat crossing through the approach path. 2 passengers spotted the rising helicopter and tried to verbally and physically warn James, the investigators found, but James never saw the other helicopter. The helicopters collided 23 seconds after the second craft lifted off at a height of about 130 feet. The investigation will look closely at the issues both pilots potentially faced in seeing the other helicopter, said Angus Mitchell, Chief Commissioner of the Safety Bureau. Mitchell said the investigation would also examine the use of traffic collision avoidance systems, which pilots reported were installed but not fully integrated into the helicopters that collided and were of limited use near helipads or while maneuvering. James told investigators he didn't hear any alert from the system before the collision. From NBCNewYork.com, mom killed, daughter injured in Suffolk plane crash. They were fulfilling a lifelong flying dream. A mother and daughter were on board the small plane as its pilot reported smoke in the cockpit before crashing near Long Island homes, killing the older passenger and critically injuring the 2 others. The burned remnants of the Piper PA-28 still lay in the North Lindenhurst field as of Monday, a day after narrowly missing a handful of homes and landing short of its destination. The NTSB said the pilot of the single-engine plane declared an emergency while returning to the Republic Airport in Farmingdale Sunday afternoon. The airport is roughly 20 miles east of New York City. Suffolk County Police said the group had taken off from the same airport at 2:18 p.m., and the pilot issued a Mayday signal a short time later. The flight school's attorney said, quote, "It was a demonstration flight, an introductory flight to see if people are interested, so it's not considered an actual flight lesson, and they received a promotional coupon from Groupon, and that's how they found the flight school." Cockpit transmissions indicate the pilot was concerned about a fire. Why the plane crashed and what may have happened in the air has yet to be determined. From Axios.com, passenger dies in severe turbulence. 5 people, 3 passengers and 2 crew were aboard a Bombardier business jet that was forced to divert to Bradley International in Connecticut while en route from Keene, New Hampshire to Leesburg, Virginia. The turbulence resulted in fatal injuries to one of the passengers, the NTSB said. It's unclear what damage the plane sustained and whether the victim was following safety protocols, such as wearing a seatbelt. Dana Hyde, 55, was identified as the passenger who died. Hyde was flying with her husband and one of her sons on a plane owned by broadband consulting firm Connexon. The NTSB said Monday the investigators are now looking into a reported trim issue that occurred prior to the in-flight upset, referring to adjustments made to an airplane's control surfaces to keep it stable and level in the air. A 2021 NTSB report found that turbulence accounted for 37% of all accidents on larger commercial planes between 2009 and 2018. From abc.go.com, FAA says airport runway incidents have risen, but serious close calls have decreased over the past 20 years. Data from the FAA shows that the number of the most serious close calls at U.S. airports has actually been decreasing, even as overall incidents have risen. Last year, there were at least 1,633 runway incursions at U.S. airports, which the agency defines as any occurrence at an airport in which an aircraft, vehicle, or person is incorrectly on the protected area designated for landing and takeoff. The number of runway incursions in 2022, including GA and commercial aircraft, is up from 1,397 incursions reported a decade prior in 2012 and the 987 reported in 2002. But the most serious incursions in which a collision was narrowly avoided or in which there is significant potential for a collision have decreased over the past 20 years, according to the agency. In 2022, there were 18 serious runway incursions in the U.S. That number is up from a low of 5 reported in 2010, but down from a high of 32 reported in 2007. The FAA's acting administrator, Billy Nolan, announced last week that the agency would establish a safety review team to examine the nation's aerospace system, saying the group will look at structure, culture, systems, and integration of safety efforts. Quote, "We are experiencing the safest period in aviation history, but we cannot take this for granted," Nolan said in a hearing on Capitol Hill. "Recent events remind us that we must not become complacent. Now is the time to stare into the data and ask hard questions." From flyingmag.com, check rides grind to a halt after IACRA system failure. In January, the FAA's NOTAM system crashed, spurring a ground stop of commercial air traffic. Today, it's the sporadic failures of the FAA's Integrated Airman Certification and Rating Application System, or IACRA, that are making it nearly impossible for designated pilot examiners to perform check rides. It's been going up and down for days, said Doug Stewart, a DPE from the East Coast. Applicants who logged in on March 1st were told, quote, the IACRA system is currently undergoing system maintenance. Some 36 hours later, the message remained up while IACRA remained down. According to Stewart, applicants who filled out their applications for their check rides are wondering if the system saved the information or if they have to fill it out all over again. On Thursday, the FAA confirmed the outage and some loss of data in the IACRA system. Check ride applicants are required to fill out an electronic application on IACRA. When they report for their check ride, the DPE uses the applicant's FTN number to retrieve the application, and then the check ride can begin. We can't get into the system, Stewart said, so there is no check ride. You have applicants who have taken a day off work and who have spent money to rent an airplane and fly to where the DPE is, only to get there, and we can't get into the system, so the check ride can't happen. It's particularly frustrating, he noted, because with a shortage of DPEs, many applicants can wait weeks for a test date. It's adding to the pilot shortage, he said. From flyer.co.uk, that's Flyer magazine, Lufthansa to be launch customer for Diamond's electric EDA-40. Diamond Aircraft has a launch customer for its all-electric version of the DA-40, and it's Lufthansa Aviation Training. The pair have signed a letter of intent to jointly explore and develop opportunities for more sustainable flight training. The cooperation includes testing of the all-electric EDA-40 in a training environment and the intention to buy an EDA-40 to supplement the current DA-40 NG fleet. Lufthansa Group said it has a goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2050 and cutting its net carbon emissions in half by 2030 compared to 2019 by continuously implementing a wide range of innovative measures. The EDA-40 will be tested at LAT's Switzerland base in Grenchen from the end of this year and into 2024. Results will help to further develop the E-aircraft for flight training and to explore options for a suitable operation of a mixed training fleet consisting of the EDA-40 and the conventional Austro jet fuel-powered DA-40NG. Diamond Aircraft announced the EDA-40 in October 2021 in response to the growing demands for an all-electric training aircraft solution in line with its sustainability approach. Total flight time is expected to be up to 90 minutes as the battery technology evolves. The EDA-40 is said to reduce operating costs by up to 40% compared to traditional piston aircraft. From GeneralAviationNews.com, failure to remove tow bar, just the first of pilot's mistakes. This comes from an NTSB report. It says, when rotating the Beech 95-B55 for takeoff at the airport in Colby, Kansas, the pilot felt the left rudder pedal slam to the floor and he could not depress the right rudder pedal. Once airborne, the airplane drifted left of the runway and the pilot was unable to apply enough right rudder to correct the heading, so he continued to climb to pattern altitude. During the climb, he saw the tow bar still attached to the nose wheel through the mirror on the left engine nacelle. The pilot phoned for assistance and then circled the airport at an altitude of 4,000 feet for about 30 minutes until help arrived. While making the last circle, he noticed the right engine lost power. He recalled that the right fuel gauge showed low and the left fuel gauge was about half full. He turned on the crossfeed and the low boost pump. He noted that the right fuel gauge began to increase. However, he told investigators that he should have turned it on earlier. The pilot reported his altitude was 250 to 300 feet above ground level at this time, and he was unable to gain airspeed or altitude. Having difficulty with directional control, he opted to perform a landing to an open field. During the landing, the fuselage and right wing sustained substantial damage. He sustained minor injuries. The aircraft manual states that the crossfeed is to be used only when the airplane is in level flight. Probable cause, the pilot's failure to remove the tow bar from the nose landing gear before takeoff, which resulted in a sustained adverse yaw condition, and his failure to adequately monitor the fuel system while circling the airport, which resulted in fuel starvation and loss of power to the right engine. From GeneralAviationNews.com, pilots encouraged to participate in medical study. Pilots are being encouraged to participate in a groundbreaking study by the University of North Dakota, UND, into the aviation community's knowledge of healthcare services and procedures and how that could impact aviation safety. The new study was spurred by a previous study by UND researchers that found pilots may be withholding information during their medicals to maintain their flight status. According to UND faculty, the recent study found that 56% of U.S. pilots reported some form of healthcare avoidance to protect their ability to fly. This discovery prompted this latest UND study, which seeks to determine if a lack of knowledge of healthcare practices in the healthcare system had a meaningful impact on these pilots' behavior. The survey takes 5 to 10 minutes to complete and does not ask for any information that would identify who the responses belong to. All responses are treated confidentially and are stored on a secure server according to university officials, and we'll include a link in the show notes as to where you can take that survey. And finally, we have 2 unusual helicopter stories, both from the Southwest. This first one from Arizona, from Fox10Phoenix.com. Phoenix City Council approves settlement for woman who spun during a botched helicopter mountain rescue. The Phoenix City Council approved a settlement for a woman who spun more than 200 times from a helicopter during a mountain rescue in 2019. The woman, Caitlin Metro, reportedly tripped somewhere along the trail, became disoriented, and needed help back down. Metro, who was in her 70s, was wrapped up and strapped in a so-called Stokes basket and gently lifted off the ground. That was when she started to spin, slowly at first, then faster and faster. By the way, I've seen the video, and the spinning starts slowly, perhaps 1 revolution per second, but then rapidly gets much, much, much faster than that. It's pretty amazing to see. Quote, "There are times when we bring the helicopter up from the ground, it will start to spin, so we have a line attached to the basket to help prevent that," said Paul Apple, chief pilot with the Phoenix Police Department, during a news conference following the rescue. As the basket comes up and nears the helicopter, the basket will start to interact with the rotor wash of the helicopter. That is when it tends to spin. It wants to windmill. Video of the rescue has been viewed millions of times online. Metro suffered swelling and bruising all over her body during the botched rescue attempt. She also claimed she suffered from pain, discomfort, and anxiety. The City Council on December 1st approved a settlement of up to $450,000. It's unclear what amount was agreed upon and approved. Metro and her husband previously filed a lawsuit for $2 million, accusing the rescue crew of negligence. According to the complaint filed by her lawyer in June 2020, she suffered multiple injuries on the left side of her body. The lawsuit accused the City of Phoenix of acting in a reckless and negligent manner, also saying that her medical expenses for recovery would continue into the future. And finally, from KOAT.com, scary situation 1,200 feet in the air for an Albuquerque Police Department helicopter which gets shot at. A man has been arrested after investigators said he shot at a police helicopter Monday night. Around 8:45 p.m., Albuquerque officers were called to the 400 block of Espanola Street Southeast in reference to several gunshots being heard. Video from the helicopter shows 30-year-old Ryan Colpin sitting on the balcony of an apartment, and he then proceeds to fire off multiple rounds at the helicopter. It also showed the pilot having to quickly maneuver, shutting off all his lights and get himself and crew to safety. Luckily, the crew was not shot or injured. This is not the first time a police helicopter in the metro area has been shot at. In 2005, the helicopter with the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office was hit by gunfire, causing it to crash near homes on the west side. The crew on board was injured. Bullets are not the only danger pilots face while in the air. 2 big issues they face are drones and lasers. APD said their air support unit has had a few close run-ins with drones. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And later we'll talk with Tom Turner about how to troubleshoot a partial or complete engine failure in flight. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let's go to the good news department. First, congratulations to Billy Haug, who passed his instrument check ride last month. That would be February. And that comes on the heels of passing his private 5 months earlier in September. And according to his proud dad, Bill, it was Billy who clued him into this podcast, and that led Bill to becoming a supporter. He wrote, "We are so proud of his aviation accomplishments and his service to our country as a member of the Air National Guard. Special thanks to his flight instructors at High Sierra Pilots in Carson City and Minden, Nevada, Connell Ford and Matt Stubblefield, and his DPE, Mark Montague. Billy is working furiously on his commercial and is enrolled in the American Airlines Cadet Program. He's also a CrossFit coach and avid marathoner, having recently gone sub 3 hours at the New York Marathon in New York under record heat and humidity conditions." So congratulations, Billy. And if you have a recent accomplishment you'd like to share, please go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page, and let me know what it is you've done recently. And here's a story I didn't mention during the news, but I did want to mention briefly. This says, snowed-in residents airlifted to safety. And this comes from aeronews.net. It says, California National Guard aids stranded San Bernardinians. Rare snowfall in Southern California left members of some affected communities stranded, with rescue coming in the form of California National Guard Black Hawk helicopters. A late February blizzard east of LA slammed the San Bernardino mountain range, where thousands live in forest communities or recreational getaways. The governor declared a state of emergency after parts of the state received more than 8 feet of snow, trapping some of their homes as crews worked around the clock to clear roads and highways. The paralyzed infrastructure led to cascading damage too, as ordinarily small issues, like single-home fires, burned uncontrollably until hydrants were unburied and roads plowed. And I'll include a link to this article in the show notes in case you want to read the full story. Now, this reminded me of the interviews I did back in episode 164 about the California Air National Guard, which rescued nearly 400 people trapped by the Creek Fire back in September 2020. And we got the inside story of that rescue by talking with Colonel Dave Hall of the 40th Combat Aviation Brigade and helicopter pilot Kip Godding. We also talked with one of their rescued hikers. So if you didn't hear that episode, check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/164. And as all of this bad weather was hitting Southern California, I was making my trip to Southern California and then flying in a Vision Jet out to Knoxville. I flew into Burbank on a Thursday night, and that was the day after a go-around had occurred the prior evening. I don't recall if we talked about that particular one. There have been so many of these recently. But a landing, Mesa Airlines CRJ-900 executed a pilot-initiated go-around as a SkyWest Embraer E-175 was taking off from the same runway. Now, as I recall, the Mesa jet was on a 1.3-mile final when the controller cleared the SkyWest for takeoff. Now, 1.3 miles may work between two Cessnas, but that's awfully close between airliners. Anyway, good that they went around. Anyway, I flew down the evening before, woke up to very cold temperatures and rain on Friday morning. I then drove with the owner to Lancaster's Fox Field about an hour away, and we passed through a lot of snow on the hills. It was really quite pretty. Now, the first time I checked the temperature for Fox Field that morning, it was 0 degrees centigrade. So we stopped to buy some gloves, since all of the places where we might possibly stop for fuel had temperatures around -8°C, and we knew it was going to be cold. Anyway, although it was cold, it was no longer raining when we got to Lancaster. We took off and we were asked to report the bases, which we couldn't do as we pretty much climbed up through a large hole in the clouds en route. Once we reached our cruise altitude of flight level 310, we had 100-plus knot tailwinds for the entire trip. Never slowed down. Ground speeds typically probably around 415 knots on that first leg. Top speed was noted on the second leg was 440 knots, so pretty good for an airplane that does 310. The fueling stop we chose was Garden City, Kansas, and that's where I saw a tetrahedron in the field, which I took a picture of, and we'll talk about that later. We did a fairly quick 45-minute turnaround, and then we're back in the air. And we could see immediately that there was a line of thunderstorms approaching Knoxville. And we spent most of the trip, I would say, talking about alternates, what we would do, where we would go if we could not get into Knoxville. And we finally settled on Morristown, Tennessee as an alternative because it was beyond Knoxville and it's unlikely that the storm would reach there. Plus, it was an easy driving distance if we stopped there. Now, the cell tops were mostly at 25,000 feet, and there was one directly over Knoxville. This particular leg was just a little over 2 hours, and we checked the weather between the ATIS report updates to see how rapidly the weather was changing at Knoxville. And in that 1 hour, it went from 11,000 feet overcast to 9,500 feet overcast, which gave us the feeling that the weather was not changing real rapidly and that things might work out. We did pick up some ice in the descent. We were cleared down to either 12,000 or 13,000, and it was still a couple degrees below zero, and we were still getting some ice, so we requested 10,000, and they brought us down to that, which brought us out of the ice. Now, we normally try to stay as high as possible, as long as possible, since the fuel burns increase substantially for jets at lower altitudes. But in this case, the paradigm shifted. Now we're in a situation where we didn't care if we burned a little more fuel. We just wanted to get out of the ice. Now, interestingly, we did hear a tiny bit of P-static, which we talked about back in episode 265, but it was so faint that I wouldn't have noticed it if we hadn't talked about it in that episode. Now, one difference this time, we turned on the TKS fluid early before we started picking up ice. And I mentioned in 265 that I had read that some VisionJet pilots believe that turning on the TKS before you start to get ice could reduce P-static. I'm inclined to believe that it may be true. Anyway, we had an uneventful night landing at Knoxville, which was great. Now, I took a photo of the tetrahedron at the Garden City, Kansas airport where we stopped for fuel, and I posted that on Patreon when I posted the show notes for our Patreon supporters. And I wrote that I only recalled seeing one other one before, which was at the Tracy, California airport, and that I had just commented the week before to a student pilot that they are rare. Here's what the AIM has to say about tetrahedrons. Interestingly, it doesn't say what airport conditions warrant their installation. Quote, a tetrahedron is installed when conditions at the airport warrant its use. It may be used to indicate the direction of landings and takeoffs. A tetrahedron may be located at the center of a segmented circle and may be lighted for night operations. The small end of the tetrahedron points in the direction of landing. Pilots are cautioned against using a tetrahedron for any purpose other than as an indicator of landing direction. I don't know what else you'd use it for. I can see somebody perhaps trying to ride it like a bull or something like that. But anyway, continuing on here. Further, pilots should use extreme caution when making runway selection by use of a tetrahedron in very light or calm wind conditions, as the tetrahedron may not be aligned with a designated calm wind runway. At airports with control towers, the tetrahedron should only be referenced when the control tower is not in operation. Tower instructions supersede tetrahedron indications. And I had a response on Patreon from a supporter Hans Cathcart, who wrote, here in NorCal, there's also a tetrahedron at Healdsburg Airport. That's north of Santa Rosa, KHES. He says, I often find it easier to gauge takeoff direction from its checkered behind than from the windsock nearby. Also, with a sloped runway, you can't just blindly trust the triangle thingy. Anyway, so much for tetrahedrons. By the way, our return trip was quite different in the VisionJet. Instead of the 100-knot tailwinds we had the entire way, we had 97-knot headwinds. And so it was a very long trip coming back with more stops than usual, but a great trip. And as I was walking into one of the Cirrus hangars in Knoxville, a gentleman who opened the door for us said to me, oh, are you Max Trescott? And he had recognized my voice. Apparently he listens to the podcast. That's Ian Anderson, so a big shout out to him and to the Cirrus Knoxville Flying Club. Cirrus has a club that their employees can rent airplanes in for a lower than market rate and get their flying certificates that way. And it turns out Ian is the president of the Knoxville Flying Club. Now they have flying clubs at some of their other locations at Cirrus, I think in Duluth and Fargo as well. Anyway, he wrote, I found your podcast to be an incredible resource and recommend it often to the club's 100-plus members. If and when you're ever in Knoxville again, would you be willing to speak at the Flying Club as part of a special event? Sure, let's see if we can make that happen. Nice meeting you, Ian. And let me briefly mention those of you who choose to support this show. Thanks so much for doing that. In the past 2 weeks since I last read names, we've had a few new mega supporters. These are the folks that support the show at the $50 a month level. They include Joey McCormick, Keith Bowen, and William Haug, and I'll tell you more about each of them in a future show. We also had 2 people sign up at the $35 a month level, so they get access to my online courses. They include Adam Groper and Wade Bethke, and we have 2 new supporters at the $8 a month level. That includes Peter Proud from Australia and Mike Linthicum. Thank you very much. We also had some one-time donations to PayPal. Thanks to Randolph Lasota, who donated $50. And from John Tuggle, I'll tell you what he donated in a moment. He wrote, Hi Max, I began listening to the show in August of 2019 when I began training for my private. I listened to a few different podcasts, but found your show to be the most relevant for pilots wanting to learn more about GA. Today, I made a $267 donation. That's $1 for each show that I've listened to. I really appreciate the hard work that you do. I also hope my fellow pilots will pitch in at any support level to keep the show nice and healthy. Thanks for what you do. I've re-listened to some shows to continue to learn more. I'm currently training for my IFR. Take care from Texas. Well, John Tuggle, thank you, sir. We greatly appreciate your support. And I'd like to invite you to do the same thing. Please go ahead and sign up to become a member and support the show. Join the club by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal if you'd like to make a one-time donation. Coming up next, our conversation with Tom Turner about how to troubleshoot a partial or total engine failure in flight. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little about Tom Turner. Tom spent 6 years in the Air Force where he was a Minuteman Missile Combat Crew Commander. Later, he earned a master's degree in aviation safety. He's held a number of flying jobs since then, including a 5-year period when he was a lead instructor at Flight Safety International, responsible for all factory-approved training for the Beach Bonanza. In 2003, he became the Manager of Technical Services for the American Bonanza Society, and he's currently the Executive Director of the American Bonanza Society's Air Safety Foundation. He holds an ATP and was named the 2010 National FAA Safety Team Rep of the Year and was inducted into the Flight Instructor Hall of Fame in 2015. Now here's our conversation with Tom Turner. Tom, welcome to the show. Great to have you back again.
Thanks for asking me back, Max.
Well, we talked last month in episode 262 about a Bonanza pilot who spent about 15 to 20 minutes trying to diagnose an engine problem before he finally declared an emergency. Just how long should it take you to walk through all the possible things that you might be able to do to fix an engine?
One of the things about troubleshooting an engine in flight is to have the patience to see if one of the things that you did fixes the problem before you move on to the next. In some aircraft types, especially the beach airplanes I most frequently fly, if you go too fast through the procedure, you might get to a situation where you make things at least temporarily worse. So answering the question, you can probably get through all of the engine troubleshooting restart steps in 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes. You don't want to go much faster than that. So you have time for gauging the reaction of each step that you've accomplished.
Yeah, my gut reaction was around a minute, but certainly 15 to 20 minutes, that's just way too long, right?
Now, I think a lot of that scenario, and again, just listening to your program and others about it, and reading the transcripts or the reports myself that we have to this day, part of the problem in that situation, I don't think was troubleshooting the problem as much as denying that a real problem existed and not trying to see what could be done about it.
Yes, I agree. So if we do have an engine issue and we know that we're going to be doing some troubleshooting, when would it make sense to turn toward the airport? Beginning of the process, middle of the process, end of the process?
Well, what I've taught for about 30 years and what I've incorporated into American Bonanza Society's programs is the philosophy that the first 2 steps of any emergency procedure are 1, fly the airplane, and 2, aim somewhere. And that somewhere needs to be the best possible option given the situation that you're in. If you have a fairly substantial loss of power, or you have an indication such as a radically dropping oil pressure or increasing oil temperature, or something that tells you that things are probably not good and they're going to get worse fast, I recommend that you aim toward the closest good landing option immediately. It may well be that one of the things that you do in the restart attempt is successful, and then you can turn back on course, or you can make probably a more measured approach to wherever that good landing option is, so you can sort out what's really going on. But you don't want to spend that minute or 2 minutes or however long it takes going through the restart attempts, flying away from the only really good option you've got if your attempt to restart the engine is unsuccessful.
Yeah, I agree. I think pilots are optimists and, probably they're thinking, oh, I'll figure this out. And gosh, I'm on course. And hey, I'm on an IFR flight plan. I shouldn't deviate from the course that I'm on. To me, that's silly. I mean, there's no reason not to just tell a controller, hey, we're checking out an engine problem and I need to head toward the closest airport immediately. And we'll let you know how it works out.
That's right. And if it's something that you resolve quickly, and it's one of those fairly rare situations where an engine problem occurs and you can do something that fixes the problem and essentially ends the emergency, you can undeclare an emergency and proceed en route. It's probably not a good idea, but declaring an emergency, even that is not something that can't be undone if you've done it earlier than you really needed to. I'm not advocating delaying declaring an emergency at all. What I'm saying is don't feel like, well, I'll probably get this fixed, so I'm going to wait to find out first, and then I'm going to deviate. Go ahead and get headed somewhere that's your best landing option and declare if you have to. Tell the controllers that you need priority if you have to, but get it headed that way. you don't want to give up that option in the process of trying to fix something that may not be fixable.
Yeah, I like when you said that it's one of these rare cases where you are able to get the engine fixed. Is that the bias that pilots should have, which is if there's an engine problem, just assume that they won't get it fixed and act accordingly?
I've rarely seen a mechanical issue get better in flight on its own. Engines rarely spontaneously repair themselves. About the only situations that I think might be resolved would be a situation with induction air, for instance, if you inadvertently fly into icing conditions in a non-ice airplane or even in an ice-protected airplane and have an obstructed inlet air filter, and in the process of going through your airplane's troubleshooting steps, you activate alternate air or apply carb heat or whatever's applicable to your airplane, and that resolves the issue. And you also, in the process of doing that, descend to warmer air or whatever it takes to extricate yourself from the conditions that iced it over in the first place, then you know what the situation was and you can proceed onward in that ice-free air. Another situation might be where you have unexpectedly run a fuel tank dry, and or even expectedly. Some people do that. That's a different story for a different day. But in any event, you've run a fuel tank dry and you're having difficulty getting the engine restarted, which happens more frequently than some people would think. But eventually you get it switched to a tank with 2 hours of fuel on board and it's running fine, and you've resolved the problem there. But just about any other situation, even if you get an early return of power, sometimes may get worse later. So don't assume that you're going to fix it. Get headed in the right direction and try to do what you can, but still expect you're going to land and get it checked out.
Yeah, good advice. You mentioned oil pressure. What's your experience or observations about when people have decreasing oil pressure? Is that almost always going to be a problem? And how quickly does the engine quit when the oil pressure starts to go down?
Well, for instance, in the case of the Bonanza that you mentioned earlier, they apparently had an oil pressure issue for some time, and it took 15, 20 minutes to turn into a catastrophic failure. But it's certainly telling you that something is not right. You're losing oil through some way, and it's probably going to get worse. So you probably have some time, but you can't assume that you have a lot of time. I still would think an unexpected significant loss of oil pressure, especially if matched with an increase in oil temperature, tells you need to get the airplane on the ground at the very earliest opportunity.
Yeah, and Mike Bush has done some data analysis, at least on the Cirrus aircraft, in which he's found that oil temperature doesn't always rise when you do have falling oil pressure. So I think a lot of people think that's the way to confirm that falling oil pressure is real or not. And that's not right. always the case.
I read what Mike wrote about that. I was a little surprised too, because for the decades I've been flying, the word on the street is, well, hey, if the oil temperature isn't going up, then you've got a faulty gauge and you're fine. Well, guess what? You can't assume that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it has to do with engines with a bypass valve that sends the oil through a cooler, which doesn't cause the temperature to rise. So, yeah, it's amazing. Just all kinds of things that are different. Well, let's talk a little about generically the different categories of things that one would look at to try and resolve partial power loss.
All right. Well, again, you've had some sort of power loss and you're flying the airplane, you're maintaining control. It may or may not be on the autopilot at this point. And I'm assuming not a total engine failure at this point. But even if you do have a total engine failure, you're flying the airplane and you're aiming it somewhere. If you have time in order to attempt a restart, just remember that any engine needs three things in order to develop power. It needs a source of fuel, it needs a source of air, and it needs a source of ignition. Any engine's going to need those three things in order to develop power. So it stands to reason that if it's not developing power for some reason, and the problem is something that you can fix from sitting in the pilot's seat, you're going to fix it by addressing those three systems: fuel, ignition, and air. Historically, if you look at accident records, and I've actually done quite a bit of research about this recently, and I noticed that Paul Bertorelli, about the time I was doing my research, did about the same thing and found that a large percentage of engine failures that result in NTSB reports are the result of fuel management or fuel mismanagement. And so historically, unless your airplane's checklists tell you otherwise, we'll come back to checklists in a moment, fuel is the first place to look. If an engine has quit, or it is developing reduced power, and it's something that you're going to be able to fix, you'll fix it most likely by switching the fuel tanks. If you switch to another tank that is known to contain fuel, switch from an auxiliary to a main tank. Most auxiliary fuel tanks in certified airplanes anyhow are placarded for use only in level flight. And so maybe you've been maneuvering and the engine quit because of that. If you switch to a main tank, that could restore fuel flow and get it started. But switching tanks is usually the first item on an engine restart checklist. Many airplanes have auxiliary fuel pumps of some sort, an electric pump. You wanted to talk about some other types in a moment, but it may be that you've had a failure of your engine-driven fuel pump and you need to activate an auxiliary system. And of course, the mixture is a fuel control as well. You may be lean of peak, and something has happened to make it go leaner, for instance. Something mechanical has happened with the mixture control or the throttle control or whatever. With some exceptions, you'll probably have some combustion available if you go to the full rich position. So what I teach, for example, in the Bonanzas and the Barons for engine troubleshooting, the first step is fuel. And in our case, we have 3 ways to adjust the fuel. Switch tanks, go to full rich mixture, activate the auxiliary fuel pump. If you've done those things, whatever applies to the particular airplane model you fly, if you've done all of the fuel modifications, if you will, that you can do from the pilot seat, there's nothing fuel related that's going to fix the engine, so you move on. The next step in many cases is to check the ignition system to verify that the magnetos are in the both position. If the engine is running roughly, you might select one or the other magneto to see if it will run smoothly on a single magneto. Now, in that case, you still have a situation where I think it's warranted to land the airplane and get it checked out because you've got an ignition issue, but you may at least be able to restore almost full power to make a normal landing. If that doesn't work, go back to the both position. Lastly, in our case anyhow, induction air. In many airplanes, there is a manual control for induction air. Some aircraft, like some of the Moonies, some very early Barons, they have a manual bypass of the inlet air filter. Well, it may be that the filter's plugged up, and if you activate the manual bypass, then you can draw in air that will allow combustion. Most fuel injection systems, engines have some sort of alternate air control that may or may not activate automatically. And in the case of most of the airplanes I fly, they have an automatic system, but also a manual backup. So you can apply that manual backup on the assumption that maybe the manual system got stuck. It didn't open up normally. But in any event, in the broad picture, if you have a loss of power and you're flying the airplane and you're aiming it somewhere, and you have the time and the altitude to attempt a restart, you'll restart by going through the fuel, ignition, and air steps for your engine. And if you've done all of those things, there's nothing you can do from where you sit in the pilot seat to fix it, so you're going to have to get the airplane on the ground. If you're flying a carbureted engine, historically, carburetor icing is the most likely cause of a power loss. And so I move that air step to the top of the list, and the air being the carburetor heat. What you're doing is you're trying to open up the induction system again by applying carb heat. So if you're flying a carbureted engine, it's air, fuel, ignition to try to get the engine restarted. You'll see that virtually all airplane pilots' operating handbooks and flight manuals that have an engine, they will have an engine failure in flight checklist, essentially follow those procedures. Manipulate the fuel system, the air system, and the ignition system to try to get a restart.
And this is a good time to bring up checklists. What you're talking about is generic and perhaps ever so slightly specific toward Beechcraft. But talk about checklist in general and the importance of using those versus what we're discussing today.
Well, checklists, especially emergency checklists, are in my opinion, are not really taught or practiced well in most general aviation airplanes. We do need to spend some time with them and be familiar with them. And when I first learned to fly, I was in the Air Force's flight screening program. We learned about what we called the bold print items on emergency checklist, and they were actually printed in bold font on the checklist. And those were things that were required to be memorized because you're not going to have time to pull out the checklist and process through them if you have to do these particular things. And so what we learned with emergency checklists is to go through the bold print items and then, as time permits, pull out the checklist to make sure you hadn't missed anything. In this particular case, an engine failure in flight, fly the airplane and aim somewhere, although they're not on the checklist. I put them on the top of my checklist. Those are memory items. And then fuel, ignition, air is pretty easy to remember. You can go through those things. If you've attempted to restart and you're still gliding down from a great altitude, or you still have partial power available, and you think you've exhausted your restart attempts, pull out the checklist if you've got the time again, and you should be familiar enough with the checklist to know exactly where to find it in your handbook. You should physically have the handbook available to you in the cockpit. It should be in the back of the airplane somewhere, and verify that you hadn't missed anything in the stress of this. But checklists are extremely important. The emergency checklists are those that will usually have at least a few things you need to memorize. To help me remember my engine failure checklist, my fuel, ignition, air step, and I actually do this when I fly along in cruise. Every now and then you're just flying along hoping that ATC hasn't forgotten you. You know what it's like. And I physically go through the steps. I reach with my hands the fuel selector, the fuel mixture control, the fuel pump switch, the ignition switch, and the induction air valve in the airplane that I fly. And I'm checking without looking that I can reach those controls. If I miss something, if I kind of my hand stumbles around trying to find the auxiliary fuel pump switch, I'll practice it a few times so I've got that memorized. So I'm not a huge fan of memorizing lots and lots of checklists because most people won't do that. But you do need to be able to hit these sorts of things, because if you do have the opportunity to restore power, you may not have the time to look up what to do.
Yeah, and also I agree, using a flow in the aircraft can be extremely helpful in emergencies. So, for example, in the Cirrus aircraft, I usually would move my hand in an L shape where I'm starting back where the fuel selector is, kind of between the two pilots, and then moving forward through the boost pump and the mixture control, moving left for the rest of the L toward the ignition switch. So, yeah, people I think should look at what is the flow in their aircraft that helps them accomplish all the things that you've just been talking about.
And then develop that muscle memory and practice every now and then so you retain that. We all have access to one of the best aircraft systems trainers available, which is the airplane itself. You can sit in the cockpit while you're on the ramp or in the hangar, and as long as you don't, move a landing gear switch or something like that, you can put your hands through pretty much all of the emergency procedures and develop that familiarity with them and that muscle memory to be able to actually accomplish them in a stressful situation.
You were talking about alternate air earlier. For people who might not be fully familiar with it, just explain generically what is alternate air and under what conditions might it need to be used in flight?
All right. Well, there are really two different things. The modern version of alternate air, and then something that was a feature in a lot of 1960s airplanes, which was a manual bypass system. Well, we'll cover that first so I don't forget to talk about it since I mentioned it. In many airplanes, example, the very early Model 55 Barons, there was the ability to manually bypass the inlet filters on the induction system of the airplane. And the idea there being that there's a little bit of loss of air pressure going through that filter itself. And so you could get like maybe another half-inch of manifold pressure if you opened up an alternative way of taking ram air just coming in from the slipstream into the engines. So that's one form of alternate air, which is just bypassing the filter system. But the more conventional now, anyhow, the more standard way of thinking about alternate air is a backup means of allowing air into the induction system if the primary means the air filter becomes plugged. In the case of most fuel-injected engines, there is simply a spring-loaded door in the induction manifold downstream from the air filter inside the engine compartment. And in normal operation, the air flowing through the induction system through the inlet air filter is tending to blow that door closed, and the spring holds it closed so that air does not come in through that way, but it comes through the normal means. If the air inlet becomes plugged up, you fly into some ice or a big cloud of dust or whatever, if for any reason that air inlet the filter becomes plugged up, then the motion of the pistons inside the cylinders creates suction that pulls against that door, against the spring on that door. And the door, in most cases, will automatically open up and allow air to come in from inside the engine compartment. A couple of issues with that. One, it is now unfiltered air. So if you're close to the ground, you're going to be sucking dust into the cylinders. That's not a good thing. And the other item is that in many airplanes, the location of that door is down in the low pressure area of the engine compartment, down toward the bottom of the engine compartment, and it's hot and the air's lower pressure there. So if the alternate air door opens up, then you get maybe half an inch to an inch less manifold pressure. And in some airplanes, even a little bit more of a reduction than that. So there's less power available. This really applies to fuel injected engines. I haven't seen very many carbureted engines with any sort of alternate air of that fashion. But as I said, in most of these designs, they will open automatically. And in some, you have the option of popping it open manually if for any reason that door had gotten stuck. So that's alternate air in most fuel-injected engines. And we don't normally talk about it in these terms, but I think of carburetor heat as being alternate air in a carbureted engine. What you're doing there is you're applying heat to melt the ice out. It's basically serving the same function. Something has blocked the induction air. You're getting rid of that blockage by applying the carb heat.
Yeah, so I guess some of the warning signs for pilots might be if they're flying in snow, if they're flying in ice, then they may need to use either the carb heat or the alternate air control.
Correct.
So in the video that you have done about this topic, you mentioned an interesting auxiliary fuel pump. Tell us what that is.
Well, you're talking about the wobble pump, WOBBLE, the wobble pump. And the wobble pump is a throwback to an earlier time. The early Bonanzas, beach Bonanzas, and many airplanes of the same era. And by early, I'm talking 1947 through 1956 models, have a manual auxiliary fuel pump. Instead of an electric pump that you turn a switch and it provides fuel pressure, you have a manual pump. There's a handle. Sometimes it will be a fairly long handle that will extend outward to give you leverage, and you pump it. You manually pump with your arm to provide fuel pressure. This is how 1930s airplanes started. This is a lot of World War II airplanes had a manual pump, and it was primarily there for priming the engine before start, but it's also there as an emergency way of delivering fuel if the engine-driven fuel pump has failed in some way. And I've spoken with a number of pilots over the years who have had failures of engine-driven fuel pumps in the early Bonanzas, and pretty much universally, after a couple of minutes of trying to fly the airplane while reaching and pumping on this manual handle, they give up and make a power off landing somewhere because it's too much workload to keep up. Some people have made it around the pattern or something like that, but the wobble pump is just a manual. It's the aviation fuel equivalent of the old water pump in Grandma's backyard that you pumped water out of a well.
That does not sound like the ideal way to fly an airplane.
No, it was what was available at the time, and in an era, as I sometimes put, in an era before ergonomics.
Well, I think Wabo would describe how I would be walking after an engine failure if I had to be pumping that thing the entire way down to the ground.
Yeah, I think so too. It would be very challenging. Some people have risen to that challenge, but it would be difficult to do.
So talk about the differences between turbocharged and normally aspirated engines as far as using the mixture while troubleshooting a partial or complete engine failure.
Okay, a couple of things about turbocharging that make the steps or the categories of possible repair, fuel ignition error, the same, but the way that you have to approach the overall failure is a little different. Turbocharged airplanes tend to have very high fuel pressures, high fuel flow rates, especially to support the power that's created when you boost the manifold pressure up beyond sea level power settings. And even aftermarket turbo normalized engines, which develop sea level power up to a higher altitude, generally have a much higher fuel flow rate in normal operation. If the engine quits, that fuel pump, while the propeller is spinning around, assuming that the reason for the failure isn't the fuel pump itself, when the propeller is still spinning around, that fuel pump is still spinning at the same rate and providing the same amount of fuel flow. But if you're up in altitude in the turbocharged airplane and the engine quits, the exhaust stops spinning the turbo around, and you're no longer boosting the manifold pressure, suddenly you will have a large drop in manifold pressure down to whatever is ambient pressure for whatever altitude you're at. But the fuel flow is at that point so great that the engine will flood. And it might be that you could fix the engine in some other way, but if you don't fix the fuel flow problem first, you may not notice that you've got the engine otherwise ready to fly. So in the mixture control step in a turbocharged airplane, instead of going to full rich, is usually, it depends on one manufacturer to another, but it's usually to pull the mixture to the idle cutoff position and then slowly advance the mixture control until the engine starts. And once the engine starts and it creates exhaust and it spins the turbo and it boosts the air again, well, then you can go to full rich with it. So an example of the engine restart attempt in a turbocharged Bonanza. The engine quits, you're flying somewhere, you're flying the airplane, you're aiming it somewhere, you've got the altitude, so you try to do a restart, pull the mixture back to idle cutoff, switch fuel tanks, and then see if you can feed the mixture in until the engine lights up. If that doesn't work, you can probably leave the mixture control at about halfway or something like that and accomplish the same thing. Try the auxiliary fuel pump and see if that fixes it. And again, if the engine relights, you can go to full rich. Otherwise, leave the mixture in this intermediate position. But you don't want to go to full rich until you're sure that the engine is going to run otherwise, because it's going to flood the engine while you're trying to restart it through some other way.
That's a great description. Thanks for walking through that. Let's talk about engines with prop controls and best glide. This to me is something that I think a lot of pilots forget. Talk about that.
Well, I think a lot of pilots forget because a lot of manufacturers don't include it in their checklist and they never learn about it. In the beach airplanes, we talk about it all the time because it's in all of the POHs. In, let's say, a Cessna 206, I'm pretty sure it's not in there. 182, it's not in there. I think it may be in the Moonies. I don't know. I don't remember. You'd have to educate me about the Cirruses because they have a different type of propeller control system. It's controlled basically through the throttle. But a propeller is an airfoil, and as it spins around in its direction of rotation, it's experiencing a certain amount of drag, and that's what helps aerodynamically cause the propeller to go to a particular speed. So it's got drag in the rotational direction, but it also has drag in the direction of flight, pointed forward. And a propeller that is at a high RPM setting, in order to be able to spin around fast, is at a low angle of attack in its direction of rotation. And which means that it's presenting a flat front or top of the propeller blade to the forward slipstream. So it's spinning around fast, but it's also getting a lot of drag. As the propeller RPM is reduced, it increases the pitch of the propeller. It increases the angle of attack of the propeller. And so it has more drag in the rotational direction. That slows it down a little bit, but it also streamlines the propeller somewhat to the forward direction of flight and reduces the drag in the forward direction. The ultimate expression of that is feathering a propeller in a twin with featherable propellers, in which case you spin the propeller around so much that its drag in the rotational direction stops it, and then it's pointed somewhat forward, and it doesn't have a whole lot of direction in a drag in the forward direction of flight. But back to the single engine airplane. If you're at a relatively high RPM setting, like you would be in cruise, and the engine quits, and you begin to glide the airplane because your restart attempts have not worked, you're going to have a lot of drag in the direction of flight. If you pull the propeller, if you have the capability, the mechanical capability remaining to get the propeller to go to its lowest possible RPM setting, that reduces the total drag created by this windmilling propeller and gives you much better glide performance. As an example, I demonstrate this when I fly in bonanzas with folks, and it is in the beach checklists for the glide to pull the propeller to the low RPM position. It's not in every airplanes, but I do demonstrate this. Well, I'll give a simulated power reduction to idle and a simulated engine failure, and I have them go through the restart steps and all that. And we'll assume that didn't work, and then I will tell them fly best glide speed and look at the resulting vertical speed of the aircraft. How fast are we going down? And in an A36 Bonanza, in a typical training weight, 2 people and about half to 3/4 fuel or something, very typically at best glide speed, with the propeller left in the cruise position, the vertical speed will be about 15 to 1700 feet per minute. Then I'll tell them, now, pull the propeller to the low RPM position, maintain best glide speed, and see what happens. So it also takes about a 5-degree nose-down pitch attitude with the propeller in the normal cruise position. When you pull the propeller back to the low RPM position, in order to maintain best glide speed, you reduce the drag so the plane goes faster. You have to pull the nose up to almost level on the horizon to maintain that speed. And the resulting vertical speed, instead of being 15 to 1700 foot per minute, is usually about 700 to 900 foot per minute. You've cut almost in half the rate of descent by reducing the drag. It's very dramatic. You feel yourself pushed back in the seats. It's the most acceleration you'll ever feel in a Bonanza. And then in my demonstration, if the engine temperatures, I'm watching them very closely and all, and if we have the altitude and the temperatures are fine, I'll ask the pilot then, now, extend the landing gear and do whatever you need to do to maintain best glide speed, and we'll see what happens. And so they'll put the landing gear down, and that, because of the added drag, requires them to put the nose back down to about that 5-degree nose down setting, and you end up back at 1500 to 1700 foot per minute. And so the point there is that the drag of the propeller, if you leave it in the cruise position for a glide, the drag of the propeller is equivalent to the drag of the landing gear. There's a lot of drag there. If you want to get that published glide performance from the POH, if you want to be able to actually glide to the end of that glide ring that's on your iPad, you have to be in the full glide configuration in the airplanes I fly anyhow. That means pulling the propeller to the low RPM position.
Yes, and I've seen this most often in Cessna 182s, and I agree when you use the word dramatic. When you pull back that prop control, it's like, whoa, you just feel the aircraft. It's no longer sinking as rapidly.
That's right.
And so it's one of those things that I think is probably the most forgotten because, yes, in Cessna checklists, I don't think I have seen that step to pull the prop back for best glide speed, so it's important that people remember that. Now, I was thinking, this is going to work fine while you still have some oil pressure. But eventually, if you have lost all oil pressure, what's going to unravel here?
Well, I get that question all the time. I've done a webinar fairly recently and a couple other videos for ABS, and I write about it a lot. And that's the inevitable question that I get. It was, well, what if you have a loss of oil pressure and you can't do this? Now, backing up, in most general aviation airplanes with a controllable pitch propeller, use oil pressure to change the pitch of the propeller blades, and consequently, as I mentioned, through the process of the drag created from its angle of attack, cause the propeller to operate at some set speed. If the oil pressure, and in most single engine airplanes, there are exceptions. There are even some exceptions in the Bonanza world. But in most single engine airplanes, if you add oil to the prop dome, it decreases RPM. And if you remove oil from the prop dome, it increases RPM. There's a spring system there, and it will spring load to the high position. It will even spring beyond the red line RPM position, and you'll get a propeller overspeed if you have a catastrophic loss of oil. So if you don't have oil pressure available, and yours is one of the majority of propellers in single-engine airplanes that will not allow you to pull it to the low RPM position, well, you're stuck with whatever you've got. And if you can't reduce the prop RPM and you're going down at 1500 RPM, that's just what you've got in this situation. I guess the good news is if you've had a totally catastrophic loss of engine oil, with luck, the engine will seize before you get too far down in your glide. And at that point, you've dramatically reduced the prop drag by stopping the propeller blades. So I guess there's a silver lining there somewhere. But in any event, you do have to have oil pressure to be able to manipulate the prop control in most cases. Interestingly, in piston twins, and almost all piston twins, the system works the other direction. A loss of oil pressure will cause the propeller to feather, and an increase in oil pressure is required to increase the prop speed. I think that the philosophy is that in a single-engine airplane, if you start to have an oil problem, the philosophy is to give you as much power as you've got for as long as you've got it. In the piston twin, what we ultimately want to do is feather the propeller if we have an engine problem, and it takes care of it for you, I guess. It's as close as we have to auto feather in a Baron, for example.
Well, this is great. Certainly, when we talked back in episode 262 about the Australian ATSB study that talked about pilots who did nothing after an engine failure had the highest fatality rate. We talked also, of course, about the Westchester crash where that pilot took an incredibly long time to declare an emergency. I guess the right answer is, boy, you got to take action, and you just can't wait forever to take action. And there are some steps that you can take.
Well, you're exactly right. My friends in the Cirrus community have a great phrase for this, that loss of control of the aircraft is always preceded by loss of command of the aircraft. And our job as pilot in command is to stay ahead of situations that will put us in a condition where we no longer have control, whether that's maintaining flying speed in the airplane and actual loss of control, or simply loss of altitude control because we've done nothing and we've run out of options. So practice your emergency procedures so that you can remain in command in these abnormal to emergency situations, so that you retain as much control as you possibly can.
Yeah, and I guess once you've worked through all of these steps that you've just talked about, at that point, you really need to accept the fact that you're probably not going to get the engine restored, and you really need to be headed to a place to land if you haven't already started doing that, which you should have begun earlier in the process.
That's exactly right. Back to my Air Force flight screening days, we taught emergencies not as individual checklists, but as what we now call scenarios. But we called them, I think they actually called it a flow back then, meaning that you flow from one emergency to another. And in our stand-up briefings before we flew, we would be presented with an emergency situation, and we had to be able to recite the memory steps and then reference the checklist from wherever that situation occurred until the point the aircraft was on the ground. So to our scenario here, engine failure or loss of power in flight, your first response is fly the airplane, aim somewhere, fuel, ignition, air. If that didn't work, that's the next checklist, maximum glide configuration. So the way I teach it now to the students in the civilian world here is that fly the airplane, aim somewhere, fuel, ignition, air. Now, commit to the glide. And committing to the glide is put your hand on the propeller control and pull it to the low RPM position in the Bonanzas. And then you fly the glide procedure. But it's actually a series of actions or a series of checklists that you'll follow up to and including evacuation on the ground after you've got the airplane stopped somewhere.
That's a great description. Tom, tell us where people can find out more about your weekly newsletter.
Okay, my Flying Lessons Weekly is a blog that usually comes out Wednesday nights, and I'm at mastery-flight-training.com. You can subscribe free there. You can also look at the Flying Lessons Weekly that's current, and there's an archives page as well. You can look back several years.
Tom, thanks so much for joining us again here today.
Thanks for having me, Max. Always glad to be here.
And my thanks to Tom Turner for joining us here today. You can read more about his newsletter and about his work at mastery-flight-training.com, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes. And if you've gotten this far in the show, let me ask for your help with one little thing. Please tell one friend about the show. That's the main way we grow the show, is by having people like you telling your friends about the show. Send them out to aviationnewstalk.com or show them how to find it in a podcast player on whatever smartphone they use. Thanks so much for your help. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember, you can always go around.